Welcome to the Ghost Diaries here, and our guest today is Micah Hanks, who is a writer, researcher, and explorer of various unexplained phenomena, which you can find on his site, The Grailian Report. Micah is also the author of a fascinating book called The UFO Singularity. One of our great interests here, sir, is, of course, the interaction between human thought and human and non-human singularities. But before we get into the singularity, I'm sure you're familiar with the Drake equation. Frank Drake, for those of you who don't know, is an astrophysicist who wrote an equation by which he estimated that there were somewhere on the order of 10,000 intelligent civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy alone. And Carl Sagan upped that number to 1 million. So I'm going to start you off with a really easy question. And I'm going to ask you how many intelligent alien civilizations are in the Milky Way and then in the universe?
Well, I think it's a good question, but we have to frame it carefully just as well. And not to detract from Drake and even Carl Sagan in terms of each individual's interpretation of the mathematical likelihood that alien life exists elsewhere in our universe. I don't want to detract from that, but I do like to point out that while we have to be scientific, and I think that mathematical models can certainly be applied to our search for extraterrestrial life. In fact, they need to be. I also like to look at things philosophically and question, for instance, how human perception would interpret what we would call consciousness or life. Sometimes I make a distinction between the two because what we would call life as we know it would be something that we would liken to being similar to ourselves, in which instances I say we're not looking for life out there or alien life. We're looking for basically ourselves. We're looking for something that is very much like ourselves and very closely within the same parameters that we would call, based on our own experience with ourselves and life on planet Earth, something within those narrow parameters of Earth life. There may be different forms of consciousness and intelligence that emanate from different physical forms, or even what we would call the lack thereof in other parts of the universe. We just don't know. It may seem unlikely, but again, that is relative to human perception of the phenomenon. And so, with regard to Drake and Sagan and utilizing mathematical information for trying to determine where alien and how alien life may exist, or even if it exists, I think that, again, the criteria maybe needs to be broadened in a philosophical sense because, again, we're looking at life more like us rather than life that would be unlike us, and there could be all different kinds of potentials.
SETI and the various groups now are starting to try and diversify that a little bit, hopefully. One of the more recent tactics I've seen that I think is pretty fascinating is the idea of two different new forms of SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. One was bio-SETI, which is the idea that we could search for an alien signature in our own DNA. We are ancestors of an extraterrestrial species, and they seeded us here. So bio-SETI is one new tactic. I mean, have they made any progress? What's the status on that? Have we found the aliens in our DNA yet?
Well, I don't know that we have conclusive proof, but I do think that what we're looking at is maybe a reasonable potential. Now, looking at a bit more esoteric source information, in my book Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule, which is available on Amazon, it's not as well known as the UFO Singularity because it's, of course, it's not directly related to UFOs, but I wrote that book a few years ago, and I did talk about some scientific attempts that utilize biology in order to try and discern if there are maybe what you would call, well, rather than a terrestrial, an extraterrestrial calling card that we could find in biological substances or even in our own DNA here on planet Earth. Terence McKenna's research and his interest in fungi. Terence McKenna is, again, not very often cited in UFO circles or as being a UFO researcher, but there are a few fascinating interviews with him online where he does talk about the subject and about, much in keeping with my own thoughts on this matter, the general complexity that we should be prepared for in terms of looking for extraterrestrial life. In other words, let's not go looking for just what we, expect aliens to be.
Right.
An anthropomorphized ideal visage of aliens, being basically, space brothers, much like ourselves. I think that as opposed to that, what we need to be looking for are these little minute evidences of something that seems a little less organic, a little less earthly. And Terence McKenna believed that he found that in looking at fungi on a molecular level. And without getting into all the terminology which I cover in the book, in essence what he found was that the little, I think what's referred to, I believe, as a pural molecule, examined, I guess, microscopically in relation to various fungi, shows that it differs greatly from other organic materials known to exist on planet Earth. Furthermore, McKenna asserted that fungi spores often can exist and even be transmitted, and then of course later grow into full-fledged adult fungi after being kept in the vacuum of space, or even potentially traveling in the vacuum of space. And so what McKenna believed was that there was a potential that something like fungi could actually have traveled from elsewhere. And he felt that molecularly, fungi might even be something that could, again, this is perhaps a stretch, but let's use our imaginations for a moment, it could be representative of some variety of extraterrestrial intelligence or other kind of organism. So when you have all this criteria for something that doesn't fit the same molecular similarities aren't necessarily in keeping with other known biological matter on Earth, and it is capable in spore form of traveling through space uninhibited and being undamaged by the vacuum. Maybe there is potential that there's something along the lines of an actual extraterrestrial technology that could manifest in a fungi-like form. It's a little bit bizarre, and it's not exactly what people would expect when it comes to talking about what alien life might be like. And whether or not, again, the point I'd like to make here, and I think that McKenna had hoped to make as well, was whether or not you could say that mushrooms literally are alien life. I don't think that's the point. It's the idea that we could find aspects and elements existing in our own biology here on planet Earth that aren't necessarily in keeping with things that we would expect to find. And I think that many exobiologists and people researching with the space program and different other organizations today that have interest in extraterrestrial life, they've begun to say, maybe we should reel in on this a little bit. And while radio astronomy and things like that may be useful indeed, they haven't proven to be incredibly useful yet, but maybe they will be one day. Nonetheless, maybe we should be looking here at Earth and looking for evidence of other kinds of life here on Earth. That may be the next logical step to finding proof of extraterrestrial life, rather than looking out there, when there could be things here on planet Earth that have not yet been discovered.
Well, I, for one, would certainly love to experiment with mushrooms with this McKenna guy, so...
I don't think he's with us any longer, but, he was an experimenter as well, and I think that his experiments with the hallucinogenic properties of psilocybin mushrooms and things like that may have even served as the inspiration some of those more bold theories.
Absolutely.
In his mind, if we had, again, potentially something that could travel through the vacuum of space uninhibited, potentially arrive on planet Earth, and then furthermore create these incredibly visionary experiences within the mind of an Earth dweller, who's to say that this isn't something we couldn't liken to being the monolith that appears in 2001: A Space Odyssey? It wasn't a great big black totem that we touch and all of a sudden our minds expand, as seen in the film. Instead, it's a little mushroom that we find growing on a cow pie that we consume.
Solutions to the Fermi paradox. I'm going to run them off, and you tell me what you think of them.
Okay.
The zoo hypothesis, which is that this is Star Trek's prime directive. And the zoo hypothesis is that aliens are out there, but they have contained us in a kind of zoo in order to observe us, which is why we don't see anything else out there.
This is very similar to kind of Cartesian philosophy, in the sense that when we look at epistemology and ask what are we even capable of really knowing, one of the ideas espoused by the great philosophers had been, what if we're actually in a situation where what we perceive as reality, much like in the Matrix films, what if it is kind of an imposed reality? What if it is actually something that we perceive as being existence and our freedom to exist within this reality, and yet what's really occurring is that there is some sort of, and I think Rene Descartes actually referred to it as a demon that could potentially be deceiving us into believing that we are awake, conscious, and free. Well, let's bring that into the 21st century. What if we were looking at an alien intelligence that was imposing a similar kind of unreality on us, or at least the perception of reality? So when it comes to the zoo theory for explaining the essentially what we could define as being the great silence, as they call it, the reason for no evidence that we found of intelligence trying to reach out to us, I would say that that's very similar to a lot of philosophical principles. More likely, in my opinion, than the idea that there are aliens that would look at us as animals and that we're being imprisoned on a great big mud ball called Earth, is that probably other forms of intelligence have evolved, perhaps in different ways on a sensory level, or even manifested in different states of being, or states of matter, or states of awareness and consciousness. And these factors are probably instrumental in their being, rather than a lack of existence or a hierarchy, maybe just a communication failure between two states of consciousness. So I think that rather than there being no evidence that extraterrestrials are out there and that they're trying to contact us, I think that maybe in truth we just are incapable as humans at present of perceiving attempts at communication, because they maybe exist outside what our sensory abilities allow us to perceive. That would seem more likely than the zoo hypothesis.
I agree. The other solutions are the whack-a-mole hypothesis, which is that I call this the bad singularity prevention service, which is that if we develop artificial intelligence and it gets crazy, they swoop in and kill us so that we don't go colonize the galaxy and set up bad Dyson spheres and whatnot. That one's fun. In the UFO Singularity, you spend a great deal of time discussing the Prometheus theory, which we referred to at the beginning, which is that alien life perhaps seeded us on the Earth. And then, of course, the final one, I'm sure there's more, but the phase transition, which is that conditions in the galaxy for intelligent life have just now begun to blossom.
Yeah, the idea that there are actual conditions within the universe that on a universal scale are just now beginning to, and when I say just now, not this moment, I mean this would obviously probably be within,
5 minutes ago, actually.
Well, a period spanning millions of years,
right.
Presumably. But even within that window of time, again, if we look at what raised Kurzweil and people like that say with regard to the potentials for transhumanism and singularity, if in Earth years, a 20-year period, according to Kurzweil, is roughly what we're going to need before we get to that point. Now, I think it may be a little longer for various reasons. Nonetheless, let's jump out there and give it, between 300 and 900 years. Where would we as humans be in 300 to 900 years? And you give that 300 to 900 year leeway, and then you apply that on a planetary scale throughout the universe, it seems likely to me that somebody else out there would have harnessed what we would call singularity-style technologies. And furthermore, that if there was indeed this kind of a universal watchdog, if there was some sort of a police force that was going to try and prevent people from utilizing nanotechnologies and all different kinds of exascale computing and different things like that to colonize the universe, that they were going to be thwarted before they did it. Well, who was the first one to get to that point? Are they the ones that are in charge of that? Is this evidence of extraterrestrial life in that sense, and is this what the UFO phenomenon represents? I couldn't tell you, but the problem I've had with a lot of the singularitarian theories is the fact that we presume that humans are going to do this at some point. And not to say that Kurzweil and others don't address the potentials for alien life, but we don't seem to see evidence of other civilizations that are utilizing singularity-style technologies. So this does bring into question a few other things. The concept of mutually assured self-destruction if warring factions on a planet within a single ecosphere, within a single biological species, or maybe depending on how things pan out with evolution on a given planet, maybe there would be two forms of intelligent life that would originate from a single planet. But regardless, if these two different factions of individuals destroy one another, as Carl Sagan had often been concerned about in the 70s and 80s, then maybe that would contribute to both the Fermi paradox as well as the potential for less evidence of singularity-style technologies from extraterrestrial sources. There are a plethora of things that the scientific community recognizes as mysteries that could be and are perhaps more worthy of study than these things that the fringe theorists tend to focus on and talk about. I would agree with that to an extent, but I would also say that when we look at great minds like Arthur C. Clarke or Philip K. Dick, again, both of these people very science-minded but also writers of fiction, what we find is that speculation, even if phrased within the context of being merely fiction, it allows us to expand our mind. And look again back at the Terence McKenna model for how extraterrestrial intelligence might try and expand our minds and hence directly influence human evolution with the utilization of extraterrestrial fungi spores and things like that. This is, again, to me, remarkably similar, both symbologically with the large black totem that we see in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's both symbologically similar, and it's also, conceptually similar to what Clarke wrote about. And the general theme that we're seeing in both narratives is the idea that an intelligence external to humankind might utilize rather subtle means, but nonetheless effective ones, for purposes of influencing human evolution, the expansion of thought, literally controlled evolution, which is part of what Singularity would entail just as well. So while I think that, yes, indeed, there are scientific pursuits that are perhaps even more important than what we would call the paranormal, I think by the same token that there are concepts that exist within the fringe literature and paranormal subject matter that are also worthy of speculative consideration and perhaps scientific consideration just as well, in terms of the way that they may lead to new ideas and new approaches to studying scientific concepts. And again, concepts that, rather than just saying, broadly scientists, I would say that academic institutions would find worthy of studying, because I'll tell you this, Jake, I've got many friends in academia. Most of them are unwilling to put their name behind papers or comments or anything like that in relation to the sort of thing that we're talking about here, but they nonetheless are very interested. They take these things seriously, and they come to me as an individual who's already put his name and reputation behind all this, and they say, Micah, I think you're right on the correct track in terms of where your thinking goes with this. And very simply, I'd like to just tell the listeners here that, for me, the journey has been one where I initially began as a person who was interested in ghosts and hauntings, claims of hairy Sasquatches and Bigfoot creatures, Loch Ness monsters swimming along in the lakes of the Scottish Highlands, and of course the potential for interplanetary visitation to planet Earth, as represented in UFO technologies, presumably. That was how I looked at this at the outset, like a lot of people do. And through mostly self-education, I have, over time, come to take indeed what many cringe at hearing, but what I call a skeptical approach. I do not dismiss the reports. I do not dismiss the encounters and the claims made by individuals, because who am I to go and say that someone else, outside my perceptual limitations, it's not fair for me to say that person didn't have that experience and that nothing exists because there's no evidence of it.
One thing we know that is going on that's now right in front of our eyes is drone technology. And these are just the very latest domestic drone is actually shaped in a triangular pattern that is often reported as a UFO. And we know that the secret military installations, whatever they got going, whatever they're working on in Area 51 or wherever they're working on, they're probably several decades ahead of what we're seeing in society. So to me, it seems, yes, something's going on, and it's in my personal opinion, it's probably most likely government technology.
I think that's a very distinct likelihood in most cases. Behind me, I don't think the listeners can see, but I actually have a legacy of both UFO case files and then also legacy classified aircraft that were put together and rendered by Michael Schratt, who at the time was working with my friends in Phoenix, the Open Minds research group. In his research, Michael Schratt seems to feel that most incidents of UFO phenomenon are actually basically something that are created here on planet Earth, and something that have been utilizing clandestine technology that the general public wouldn't be generally in the know about. I mean, there are a variety of parallels to conspiracies and UFOs and the plot for the New World Order, as people call it, to try and take over and whatnot. And even Jacques Vallée, the ufologist, has referenced psychological warfare and things like that in the past that would have been utilized for purposes of misleading different portions of the public. I think one instance had been, during the Kennedy years, there had been a plot that had been proposed where we would utilize hologram technologies to try and essentially project images of Christ on the coast of Cuba for purposes of making an invasion more feasible.
Oh, I didn't know they were going to do that in Cuba. Oh my God, that is...
I believe, Jacques Vallée, I've got an audio soundbite someplace that I'll try and find and send to you where Jacques Vallée talks about this. And the point is that psychological warfare has been, whether or not it's been implemented, it's been considered in many instances, and I'm certain it has been implemented in plenty of others. And so, in terms of the UFO phenomenon, two of the complexities that emerge just based around your question here is that, A, we do have, I believe, clandestine technologies that account for probably the majority of UFO accounts, but then there's also the potential that information would be maybe purposefully put out there in a misleading way so as to further confuse the populace and misdirect people away from secret technologies. When it comes to drones, I think that probably the most advanced drone that civilian, people like you and I would have awareness of would be the XF-7B that the Navy has been utilizing. And we've seen photographs of this. It looks kind of like a small jet, but it doesn't have a rudder or a tail, and so when viewed from the side, it looks very saucer-like. And in fact, while the XF-7B was being carried, I believe, on the back of a flatbed truck last year through the District of Columbia, there have been a lot of people tweeting and taking photographs and actually saying it looked like a UFO was being transported right through the nation's capital. So yes, some of these technologies are already being mistaken for what we'd call saucers or UFOs. These are just the ones that we know about. And what I find funny is that speaking with a very well-known skeptic writer at the International UFO Congress earlier this year, I was having this discussion with him, and I said, I think it is more likely that a lot of the UFO reports, actual reports of things seen in the sky, have to do with government technologies that have not been released fully to the public yet. And the gentleman said, you believe that? And I said, well, I'm careful about committing to belief in anything. Again, I think that that's more likely possibility than extraterrestrial visitation accounting for all these strange craft. And he says, well, I don't buy that either. Even though, again, this seems like something that would be more logical for a skeptic to advocate. And I said, well, okay, why do you feel that way? And he said, well, because the government's going to eventually release that information. Those documents never end up being released, and so we have no evidence of there being secret government technologies that would, account for these things either. Which then made me feel, well, then are you advocating? And I asked him, I said, are you telling me then that you think that there's another explanation for some of these UFO reports? He said, absolutely. People are just lying. They make stuff up. I don't think it's just so simple as to say that this is all a psychological or a sociological phenomenon. Clearly there is some sort of a technology behind some of these reports, but I don't think that we can discount so naively that government would possibly withhold information from the public just as well. So, again, it answers your question. Yes, I think that drone technologies, often in experimental stages, and with regard to technologies and programs that are not public level of knowledge, I think that would have to constitute a lot of UFO reports. And in fact, they likely do. And there's some historical precedent as well as evidence that shows, I believe, that there are technologies that are being utilized behind the scenes, and that this is not, again, as some skeptics would tell you, it's not something that is just released to the public and we know about everything that exists. This is a common flaw in logic that I find is that a lot of people who are really so, almost mechanically hard-line skeptic, because I don't want to paint all skeptics with the same brush any more than I want to do that with the scientific community. I call myself a skeptic, but some of them are so point-click hard-line with their perceptions that they think that anything that goes beyond what we know or can prove simply doesn't exist. And in that criteria, what doesn't exist means those things that may exist, but that we don't have full knowledge of. Again, I could tell you any number of different things that, pertain to what goes on in my office or in my home. I couldn't tell you what happens in somebody else's living room or in their bedroom at night. We could speculate, but I'm not going to tell you those things don't exist because I don't have direct access to that information. And I see that some skeptic thinkers tend to do that just as well, even when there's a much more plausible theory as to what these UFO craft actually are. Yes, I'm pretty sure that some of these things are government craft, and know that we're not getting the full story from government for reasons of national security and other clandestine purposes.
No, I think the gentleman you talked to is right on the money. The government has never withheld anything from the public. It's just, it doesn't happen. They don't.
Not a slightly naive statement.
Yeah, slightly ignorant statement. My experience, I was kind of obsessed. Of course, everyone read the singularity is near and got obsessed with it and ran around saying we're all going to become hive mind AI overlord gods in the future, and that's fun. Kurzweil, who we all know is very afraid of dying, has developed a kind of cult around this, and it's I do call it a cult. In some sense, I think of the singularity as a social movement. It is the main belief system for a certain economic class of technocratic often libertarians who have an invested interest in deregulation. In what sense do you balance the social needs of singularitarians with any kind of practical reality that may occur in the next 30 years?
Well, I'll say this. In my book, The UFO Singularity, and phrasing at the outset what singularity is, I think at one point I say we call this the singularity, which some may construe as me being, or me asserting that I am a quote-unquote singularitarian, and a person who embraces this, what I think amounts to, in many aspects, as a mythos surrounding where we'll be a few decades from now. Some of it is obviously wishful thinking. Some of it's probably right on the money, and that we're going to see these technologies within the next few years. But I think that what you just brought to the table in terms of the cultural aspects, the sociological aspects, the social movement, and the way that singularity has become kind of something that people can feel that they're a part of, let's wait and see how long before there are what we would call singularity advocates or singularity political activists and things like this. I mean, I think that there already are some of those. What I think we'll see is that, very similar to what we saw in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago with the citizens' hearing on UFO disclosure, we're going to begin to see people who are going to be arguing for the freedom of use of technologies that will be entailed within a Kurzweilian view of the singularity. His viewpoints are often very hopeful and positive and even utopian at times, whereas there are many who say, actually, if this technology were developed, first, the government's going to have it before we do. Second, there's going to be essentially kind of a class warfare that will emanate from people who have access to this technology versus those who do not. And so it's not going to be all hearts and flowers like Kurzweil says. All these things point to the idea that, for me, what we're already seeing in the UFO community, where people are beginning to become, advocates. And they're advocates of what? They want disclosure, full disclosure of information, not just about UFOs, but as many of them have actually termed it, evidence that is being withheld by government that alien life is visiting Earth. If there's one good reason I could imagine why the government won't release that information, it's because they don't have it, okay? And if we see a similar thing begin to erupt around singularitarians, whether they are right or wrong, I don't think that that's something that we can really state conclusively right now, because we're not to that point yet. We have not seen the singularity. We haven't seen that point that Werner Vinge referred to as being a point where strange things are happening all around us that we can't account for, unless you want to look at things in terms relative to ufology and whatnot, which case, I guess we might assert that if that is any evidence of some sort of a technology that exists beyond our own, and that what Werner Vinge had called singularity could be likened to us perceiving UFOs in our environment, then the singularity may have been near as far back as 1946 or 47. I'm predicting that we're going to see very similar trends in the singularitarian movement, and if it's not already a movement, I think it is, but it certainly will become more evident that that's what it is in the coming years. And we're going to see people who are becoming activists and politically involved in pushes for freedom of access to information and technology, and maybe even disclosure of whether or not that technology is already being utilized by government organizations, just like what we're already seeing in UFO literature and UFO communities, which again is the primary reason why with my book, The UFO Singularity, I sought to try and draw parallels between singularity and UFOs. There are both, I think, technical and logical applications that we can derive from looking at those two juxtaposed against one another, but sociologically we're going to see that the UFO movement and the singularity movement are going to be probably close cousins in just a few years.
It's ironic. Yes, the singularity will not be televised, I guess, is what they would want to say with that. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I do think that many aspects of the singularity will come to pass.
Sure.
I didn't want to make it seem like I didn't believe in that, but I think we're also definitely seeing the foundation being laid for a tremendous struggle between the private sector and the government as far as acquiring these technologies and having the right to use them in what ways they want. I guess I'll close off with a final thought experiment question, which is that provided that we do develop artificial intelligence, and I think it'd be hard to say at this point, with Kurzweil actually working for Google now, which is terrifying in its own way, it seems like artificial intelligence probably will happen. and strong artificial intelligence. And so now we have to ask ourselves, what are they going to do with this? I don't see a Terminator situation, because they'll be a lot more efficient than that if they want to kill us, But do you think the role of artificial intelligence could or will be in terms of balancing the human urge toward destruction?
Well, the creation of artificial intelligence, which some would define the singularity as being the creation of intelligence that exceeds levels of human intelligence, hence the implication that we will create artificial intelligence, where we will utilize our artificial means to, implement, broader capacities, for human intelligence and actually expansion of human potentials. I think the creation of artificial intelligence, or intelligence amplification for that matter, or both, will literally be the next stage in human evolution. That's very uncomfortable for a lot of people, but again, if we want to look at this in terms of a Judeo-Christian perspective on things, God creates man in his image, and then, Jesus Christ says that you will go on to create greater miracles than I have. Looking at those two things and inferring them in a technological sense in the modern era, I would say that it's very likely that we are going to, much as God created Adam, we will create intelligence in our quote-unquote image. It may not be that we create cyborgs that take on a human appearance, but we will create consciousness, and we will create intelligence that is capable of functioning consciously, similar to the way that the human mind functions. Possibly that will be capable of doing so even better than humans are capable of doing, and furthermore, that intelligence may be capable of self-replication, which allows the creation of even more intelligence. What if God designed us to be beings that were capable of improving? We'd be awful stale, and frankly very unexciting if we weren't capable of bettering ourselves, right? And it's a very hopeful and a beautiful thing to me to think that humans, not only in the immediate sense, can better ourselves and make decisions that improve not only our lives, but improve the lives of others, but that we are over time capable of improving ourselves, and that through the utilization of technologies that lead to advanced artificial intelligence and perhaps intelligence amplification, we are in a sense taking evolution into our own hands, but that this is maybe part of this divine universal concept that, we are individual, we are free, and we're capable of bettering ourselves and those around us, and maybe even the world around us just as well. And so, again, people will find issue with that and think that it's a very detrimental thing and something that's maybe against the idea of the relationship between God and man. I again remain neutral on all those points and invoke those kinds of terminologies for purposes of saying that it wasn't bad when God created us. Maybe it won't be so bad when we create artificial intelligence, and maybe, just maybe, those intelligent creations won't come back and try and kill us. And personally, I don't advocate the Terminator theory either.
Well said. Micah Hanks, are you working on anything new?
There is a new book that will be shortly released. It's called The Ghost Rockets, and this book is looking at not just a classic UFO phenomenon from the 1940s. It begins there, but I look at everything up to the present day in terms of reports of missiles. Not necessarily missiles that are, again, ufological in nature. They would only be UFOs by virtue of the fact that they're flying, they're unidentified, and they appear to be objects. In many cases, I think that these are very clearly errant missiles that were involved with military projects and things like that. There are some instances where some of these objects may have led to aviation accidents and things like that. There's a new documentary coming out soon that makes the same allegation about the TWA Flight 800 case. I look at that case. I don't advocate a missile theory per se, but I do acknowledge that there were reports of what were described as being rockets, at least 4 of them, in the months before and after the TWA Flight 800 incident. So the Ghost Rockets will be released very soon, and people can find more information about that at my website, which is micahhanks.com. I've got the Graylian Report as well as micahhanks.com. And actually, we're doing this on a Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. I also stream the Micah Hanks program on the KGRE radio network. So again, micahhanks.com will give you all the information about that.
Tune into that, everyone. Micah, thank you so much for joining me. It was a real pleasure speaking to you.
Pleasure is mine. Anytime, Jake. Let's do it again, okay?